we will open things to the floor. So the first presentation then is by Phil Lane on international financial positions of emerging market economies in particular.
Thank you. So it's a great pleasure to come back to Korea to participate in this conference. I think the topic is extremely well timed, so I was very pleased to look at this topic in this context. So in relation to the operation of the international financial system and the dynamics of international financial flows, it's clear that it's a very volatile system, that you can clearly break up the narrative of the international system into different phases. So, of course, it's easier to look backwards than to look forwards. So, looking backwards over the last decade or so, clearly we can strongly differentiate between, if you like, the kind of boom period from about 03 to 07, when global flows were extremely high. Then, from summer 07 through summer 08, a marked slowdown, and of course then the severe crisis in late 08, early 09. And then the next phase, really from 2010 onwards, was a significant rebound in capital flows. But it's important to say, first of all, it was quite differentiated across countries, and it's very EM focused. So, if you look at the advanced economies, capital flows are still subdued relative to pre-crisis levels, whereas in the emerging markets, there's a much more rapid recovery. And of course, what's interesting is to look forward. And we think, or at least my view is, here in mid-2015, is we definitely seem to be at a position where there may be a new phase beginning. And again, looking back, when we come back to this a few years' time and look backwards, we might be able to look at some hints in terms of the week-by-week news flow, the week-by-week reporting of a whole pile of different indicators. So, for this question, of course, we have in the topic of the conference. European monetary policy is not normalizing anytime soon, so the officials tell us. But in the US, and the dollar is the key currency for the global financial system, at some point, maybe delayed, but at some point, we will have this return to interest rate normalization in the US. But over the last year, one of the byproducts of that has been significant dollar appreciation. And of course, this is a time-honored topic in the context of the international financial system, given that so many liabilities are funded through dollars. Dollar appreciation raises questions about valuation effects, sustainability, disappointed expectations, and so on. And it's the context now of that in combination with a decline in, if you like, the pull factors. First of all, in recent years, again, there's a lot of differentiation across countries, but you can definitely identify emerging markets where the external positions are weaker now than they were in 07. So net international investment positions more negative, current account balances less positive or more negative in a number of cases. And it's not just the external account. Again, we've seen downward revisions in growth prospects for quite a number of emerging markets, and also movements in terms of trade. So again, that's going to vary a lot. It depends on what kind of goods you're producing. For commodity producers, depends what you're producing. Clearly, we know oil prices have fallen quite a bit, and some commodities, other commodities are doing better. So, it's important, in what I say here is I'm not saying emerging markets as a whole category are necessarily in trouble. I think in my conclusion I write some emerging markets. And, today I'm not going to try and say, here's my top 5 flashing red lights. But it's the combination does mean that I think it's right to discuss this topic at this point. So in the paper, what do I do is, first of all, I do have a kind of review of why should we care. So international financial flows, why Charles Engel at the IMF research conference back in November, in his paper for that conference, I think is in passing a common basis saying it's really hard to link international financial flows to macro outcomes. It's very hard to do in a model. It's very hard to do it in the data. Unless you talk about crisis episodes, it's not super clear why central banks and so on should really care too much about financial flows. So I want to make the case in the paper about why, in fact, there is enough evidence to make us believe that it is important to understand the cross-border component. And then in the paper, the next step is I go through the what's been happening with a focus on the most recent number of years, and to identify where some of the risk factors might be emerging. And then I also have a forward-looking piece about, is the last number of years just a response to QE, or is it more of a long-term trend? And my sense is more of a long-term trend, maybe accelerated by QE. So the management of these risks is not just a temporary transition issue during QE. It's more as middle-income countries get richer, as their financial systems develop, their international financial positions are going to look more normal in the sense of looking more like the profile for advanced economies. All of which leads to the policy issue, which I know we'll come back to again today and tomorrow in the conference, which is you need extra instruments. You need to think about macroprudential policy as well as interest rate policy and fiscal. So, I don't think it's a great use of time to go through the great detail of the literature on why international financial flows may carry risks. But I would emphasize, in thinking about this issue, there's really two dimensions. One is the net flow, which is going to be the counterpart to current account imbalances. And it's important to say here, the risk factors in terms of the chronic risks apply to surplus countries as well as to deficit countries. Essentially, if you're running a large surplus or a large deficit, you run the risk of a sectoral misallocation. Essentially, your traded sector gets too large or too small relative to non-traded sector. That might be okay in a world where it's easy to move resources across sectors. It's not so okay when there might be learning by doing in terms of productivity, or if labour markets find it hard to reallocate workers across sectors, or if banking systems find it hard to reallocate credit between traded and non-traded sectors over time. But of course, a lot of focus is on the acute risk factors, which are probably more concentrated on the deficit countries. We know, and the most recent episode in 08-09 has reinforced that if there's a sudden stop, a sudden reversal in flows, you might hope for some easy adjustment, but the data is overwhelming that it's associated with severe macro distress. And I would emphasize that on top of the flows, because the flow issue is one thing. There's also the stock issue. Even if you close your current account deficit, if you're carrying around a large stock of external debt, you have rollover risk as a perpetual risk factor, and that's significant. After the crisis, current account imbalances, by and large, did narrow. But net international investment positions have not narrowed. There's lots of countries with high net IIPs. But for financial stability reasons, maybe more than pure macro, the gross financial flows matter as well. And this is where, over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a lot of work, but honestly speaking, I think it's still very much in its infancy, trying to understand what does it mean when you have high flows, even when the net flows are small. And you can point to a number of reasons why there may be risk factors hidden in those high gross flows. Basically because of mismatches. You might have short-term inflows funding long-term acquisitions. You might have foreign currency debt funding positions in domestic currency, or you might have be borrowing in dollars to buy euro-denominated assets, which doesn't work out very well in recent times. You have equity debt asymmetries. Asymmetries across sectors, which I'll come back to later, depending on what sector is engaged in the transaction, and then geographic asymmetries also. And throughout here, again, if you try to make the link between the cross-border component to the overall macro situation or the overall financial stability situation, I think the trend in this literature is essentially to try and build a full flow of funds. That it's not really, the cross-border element has to be integrated about how that cross-border flow is transmitted domestically. So thinking about how the cross-border debt flows influence domestic credit dynamics. Because clearly most corporates and households rely on the domestic banking system for credit. So how are domestic credit dynamics influenced by international flows? Another dynamic is essentially the public-private split. So does it create moral hazard issues if the public sector maintains a strong international balance sheet? Does that encourage risk-taking by the private sector? And I think that's one of the issues that we're seeing in some countries. And the question is whether there's a beliefs of implicit bailout promises there, and whether those bailouts will actually happen or will be a false expectation. And let me emphasize in terms of sectors something that's relatively new. In the crisis and pre-crisis period, a lot of the debate was about the banking system. So the main transactor in international debt markets were banks. Banks raising international debt, cross-border interbank market, and so on. And with the restrictions on banks, more regulation, with banks deleveraging and quite restricting their behaviour, what we've seen is this movement away from banks, in part towards other financial intermediaries, but in part towards direct cross-border financial transactions by the corporate sector. And the BIS and Hyun-Shin, both at Princeton and at BIS, has written a lot of, I think, very good material on this topic. Now, at one level, it's natural. If you have more and more multinational corporations, there's going to be a natural reason to have more and more international financial transactions for treasury reasons. But the issue is, especially when you might have asymmetries in the level of financial regulation, whether there's a temptation for corporates to act as financial speculators. So if you have corporates who are borrowing overseas, not to fund capital expenditure, but to fund carry trades of different types, then there may be risk factors. Some of those risk factors are the standard risk factors facing any intermediaries, but corporates don't have access to a lender of last resort. So you have, if they overly rely on bond funding, they face the risk that those bonds may not be rolled over. So in turn, they're reliant on the stability of the bond fund industry, which I think Dong Hae will talk about later on. You face the risk that if they make a bad bet in terms of financial speculation, the corporates may make losses, not for related to production, but related to financial speculation. And in turn, you might say, well, if corporates make losses, the shareholders lose, and that's it. The problem is if these corporations are intertwined with the domestic financial system, both in terms of if they're doing carry trade by borrowing overseas to lend in the domestic system, or if they have dual liabilities, they're borrowing from domestic banks and from foreign markets, and there may be problems there. So, I think that there's a range of issues here that need to be looked at. So anyway, let me, look at some of the data here to see, is this a big issue or not? So in the paper, partly it's a review of what's been going on at a global level. And the first figure in the paper just is a reminder that for all the talk about emerging market activity, it's still the case emerging markets are relatively low participators in global markets compared to the advanced economies, especially within Europe. So the blue line tells you that the fraction of assets and liabilities relative to GDP of the advanced economies, and the red line is a similar ratio for an aggregate of emerging markets. And what you see is, in both cases, it's gone up over time, but it's really, it's a different order of magnitude for the advanced economies. Yes, there was a dip in 07, 08, but the positions have gone up since then. So, is there any reason to be concerned about emerging markets? So in terms of current account balances, what you see here in Figure 2 is, if you like, just in most recent years, since 2010 onwards, there has been some decline. So essentially the most conservative emerging markets are running smaller surpluses. Those emerging markets, the 25th percentile, the way I order it, the bottom quartile, the current account balances have slipped outwards, slightly more negative since 2010. But it's important to emphasize it's not off the charts negative. It's just a clear pivot in pattern. In the interest of time, I'll skip some of what's in the paper. So in the net IIPs, so the stock positions, again, there's been some deterioration everywhere. So the amount of emerging market economies which are net creditors, that's declined. Those which are net creditors are less of a net creditor than they used to be. But you have at the median and the lowest quartile, again, a significant slippage compared to pre-crisis behavior. So, when we wrote about, myself and Malaysia Ferretti were writing around 2007, we essentially were saying that the emerging markets were maybe being overly conservative, that essentially were really building up really strong international balance sheets. Now, that proved to be pretty helpful during 08-09. To strong international balance sheets during the crisis was probably, quite helpful. And then when QE came along and essentially the world was, saying, they want to lend to emerging markets, it's rational to some extent to say, well, let's have a recalibration here. These countries can afford to increase their amount of international debt liabilities and afford to run less positive net positions. The question is now at this point whether all of these countries are calibrating perfectly, have some countries overdone it. So if you focus in on the foreign currency issue, what you see is, again, some deterioration everywhere, but really it's the bottom quartile. The bottom quartile of emerging markets here, their net foreign debt position has gone from about minus 25 to minus 40% of GDP. So that's a significant change over a 4 or 5 year interval. Within that, the context, as I mentioned, it's less and less owed to banks. More and more is owed through the bond market. So, since 07 to now, it's gone up for about 16 or 17% to about a quarter is bond funding. And this is the stock. So, in terms of the net flow, you can see a lot of it being concentrated in the bond market in recent years. You see here, you might say, well, according to BIS, it's mostly financial corporations. The blue line are financial corporations. That is an important point here to notice, is those financial corporations are typically the financial affiliate of a non-financial corporation. So there's an interesting work at the Bank of Spain, which basically traced through lots of detailed corporate accounts. Here's just a few examples where these are listed as financial corporates in the BIS data, but they're affiliates of underlying non-financial corporates. So, it's the well-known cases like Petrobras, Lukoil, and so on. There's lots of fascinating financial engineering going on in the global system. So the right number, I think, to look at is the sum of corporate and non-financial, financial corporate and non-financial corporate together because of that crossover. So what you see, anyway, is this really sharp increase. And let me emphasize, yes, domestic currency bond markets have gone up, but most of this debt is being funded in foreign currency. So the classic topics in terms of foreign currency debt re-emerge in different ways. And there are big questions here, because it might be the case that the overall economy it has a balanced foreign currency position because the foreign currency debt of corporates is offset by the foreign currency assets of the central bank. Of course, that's going to lead to a lot of policy questions about if those corporates get into trouble, what exactly is going to be the attitude of the central banks? What are the policy instruments of governments through sovereign wealth funds and of central banks to deal with that issue? So in the last part of the paper, which I don't really have time to discuss, but in tomorrow's panel I'll come back to when we talk about macroprudential policy, I go through some of these issues about the standard issues of how to use macroprudential policy to balance these issues. But let me maybe just take half a minute to emphasize is even if you have emerging markets that, if you like, remain quite strong. So I think my view is a lot of emerging markets are still in pretty good shape compared to historical norms. This is not an issue that's going to go away. That as these economies improve their domestic financial systems, as they grow richer, as demand for institutional investment and so on goes up, it is going to be the case that the really strong balance sheets these countries had in 2007, I don't think are going to be repeated because it's too expensive. The risk-return trade-off is too attractive to nudge it towards a riskier profile. And so this issue about managing cross-border financial risk in emerging markets, I think is basically a long-term feature we're going to see. That the pre-crisis period, I think, was a special period. We're more likely to see significant foreign debts for these countries, and so the issue of how to manage those foreign debts when you have global financial shocks, I think, is back on the table. But let me stop at that point.
Thank you very much. So there still is time, Philip, for you to tell us who the top 5 countries on your list are. The discussant of this paper is Alan Taylor of UC Davis.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Barry and Tom, for the invitation, and to the Bank of Korea for organizing this event. I enjoyed this paper enormously, and in 10 minutes I'll have to try and get through the discussion. So as I was preparing, I of course saw something that made me think, aha, this is exactly what Phil is talking about. It was last Monday, Petrobras issuing a bond. And everyone in the press was worked up because it was a 100-year bond. And so the maturity was impressive, which is a sign of maybe, the phenomena we're witnessing here. And some were impressed by the yield, which was high because there's a corruption scandal at Petrobras. But I was impressed in the context of Phil's paper that this is just a microcosm of the kind of mechanism he's stressing that we're going to see more of in the years ahead, more corporate borrowing in foreign currency, enlarging the liability side of the emerging market balance sheet. But I want to try and put that into the bigger picture, as the paper does. And I want to focus on the introduction, or the abstract even, where Phil says the long-term challenge for emerging economies is to combine more symmetric international financial positions with domestic macro-financial stability. Now, the stability part is like motherhood and apple pie. One really can't be for or against that. One has to be for that, I suppose. But is the symmetry part either necessary or sufficient to go hand in hand with the other part of that combination? And I face 2 temptations as a discussant here. Futurism, can we and should we and will we end up going in a certain direction? Or history, trying to figure out how we got here and what light it might shed on the future. So we heard reference to Yogi Berra earlier in the comments of Bill White. He's supposed to have said prediction is difficult, especially about the future, but I'm informed by the internet that was really Niels Bohr as the original remark. But I'm going to rely on Bohr and advice from Keynes to study the present in light of the past for the purposes of the future, and I'm mostly going to be backward-looking, given my part-time status as an economic historian. So just a quick review of how we got here, a brief history of the emerging markets. The stylized facts of the 70s and 80s are receding into the rear-view mirror. Back then, the emerging markets were typically net debtors with large negative positions. But the gross positions were relatively small compared to today, and reserve holdings were small. In the language of Phil's paper with Jay Chambord, the FX aggregate exposure was probably negative, but it wasn't offset by any reserves. Then we went through the 70s and 80s, the debt crisis, an expansion of both gross and net positions, and an expansion of risks, and including the increase in the FX mismatch problem. And then as we transitioned through that and into the 90s, a fear of floating emerged, given that FX exposure, and also the financial systems were growing, perhaps raising the risks of double drains from banks to currency to FX. Then in the 90s, it really all builds to a perfect storm. These chickens come home to roost in the emerging market crises. And we're still living in the shadow of that. One of the earlier discussants, pointed to, what had happened here in Korea was the 2003 change in macro pru, an anticipation of 2008 or a reaction to 97, 98. So then come along higher frequency financial and currency crises, and with higher intensity. One of my favorite charts I often show my students is by Nouriel Roubini at NYU. It shows FX exposure times depreciation on the x-axis, severity of crisis or downturn on the y-axis, and there's a very clear correlation between those two variables in the various crises around the world. And we know that in addition to that, given twin and triple crisis risks, these things just feed off of each other, and that raised the scope for great disruption. So there was a lot of head-scratching in the 90s, post-mortem about the old rules of thumb, which went back to the Bretton Woods period. How much reserve ratio cover did you need relative to imports or whatever? And there was a sense that we were moving towards new ideas, especially with increasing financial openness, more financial development, and more maybe hot market flows. And I did some work on that with Jay and Maury Obstfeld, suggesting that maybe it was those trends that were behind policymakers' thinking. So that's where we get to in the 2000s. The emerging markets, including, of course, Korea, react to these liquidity risks with what Marty Feldstein called self-insurance. They can't or felt unable to or unwilling to float serenely and cleanly. That was one constraint. The other constraints were they didn't want to shut off capital mobility. They couldn't, in extremis, rely on market funding, and they were unwilling to rely on IMF or official backup funding with all of the strings that came attached to it. So what was left as the remaining solution was to build up a large war chest of foreign reserves to try and fix the mismatch problem by piling up that war chest. And that ultimately, as Phil and Jay's work has shown, reduced their foreign currency mismatch, their exposures, even turning them around. Okay, so that's the end point of the conventional wisdom in 5 minutes. And now this paper, for me, was an opportunity, an attempt by Phil to walk us back through that history and let us try to verify, what is the content of those stylized facts? As I often say to my students when they present something, I say, is that stylized? And is it even a fact? And I think it was valuable here to go back and look at what's happened. So in my thinking, this was always a transition. It wasn't necessarily going to be an ongoing process. You'd require large surpluses for a time. There may be some global impacts if that's happening in a lot of countries and if some of them are very big. But it might slow down once you reached a reserve target. And at that point, it may be so large that you might hardly ever need to use it if the threat was there. And that then carried with it the debate over how big did it need to be and what would be the costs and benefits in terms of carry or lost investments. I'm thinking there of the work by Summers and Roderick discussing that about a decade ago. So all of that seemed very plausible as a stylized fact if you were talking about the emerging markets as if they were one big entity. But is it really true? And with this backdrop, I came to Phil's paper and discovered that, it may be true on average or for the more noteworthy or the more conservative emerging markets, but there's a great deal of heterogeneity out there. It's not really true as a general story. It may be going into reverse, although maybe not. And so it's very hard to tell whether we've been through a transitory or temporary transition or whether we're in something permanent. And that raises questions about fragility. So, my takeaways from Phil's paper. Figure 1 seems quite reassuring. That's the first thing you see is reassuring. The emerging market gross positions have not been growing astronomically compared to, say, the advanced economies. They've sort of been leveling out. I'd just like to see a percentage scale, though, please, Phil, to match the others. So that seems reasonably reassuring. On net flows, what I found here was that despite the story of emerging markets swinging into surplus to build up their war chests, that wasn't really true. It was certainly not true for the median economy. It was true for the top quartile. They were swinging into large current account surpluses, but a lot of other countries maybe still had deficits on current account, consistent with vulnerabilities that might show up in times of stress, say in the case of the taper tantrum, when the markets were out there trying to sort the emerging economies into, which ones were fragile, which ones were not. So a lot of variation there. Accumulating those flows up, we find that very few emerging markets actually went from net debtor to net creditor status during this transition. The median emerging market still has a negative net foreign asset position. So the war chests have grown, those are the official outflows, but so too have the downhill investments, the private inflows. Notwithstanding the so-called Lucas paradox, in fact, private capital has been flowing downhill, and the neoclassical model has been working in that sense. So in terms of although that's a good thing maybe in terms of growth and efficiency, it's largely a wash in terms of these international investment positions, and if your view of emerging market vulnerability rests on that, maybe a point to worry about. Lastly, we get to composition. The foreign currency mismatch has obviously improved. That was the story of the transition from the 90s to the 2000s, and it's sort of leveled off. But even for the median country, this is now in positive territory. So that might seem like good news. Another scale in percent there, please, Phil. But the kicker here came at the core of Phil's conclusion, which is that these flows take on various attributes. First, a lot of them are debt flows, and if we take total debt position, you might say it's okay if that flow downhill to the emerging markets was sort of a cold FDI long-term flow, but it appears that, from Figure 5, that a lot of these flows are net debt, and that's even when we offset them against the liquid reserve position on the other side of the ledger. And Figure 6 here, the sixth takeaway, confirms that. Debt is taking up a bigger share of liabilities in the emerging world, so that's the gross position. So you say, okay, well, maybe that's not great, but maybe this is increasingly local currency and not foreign currency, so that might be reassuring. We've gotten away from original sin. Well, maybe not. The seventh takeaway is that the emerging market debt issuance boom, like the Petrobras issuance we had at the start, it shows some type of, recovery from issuing almost nothing in local currency. The red line is rising, but it's rising from a very low base, and everything is still being dominated by FX bond issuance in foreign currency. And then the last point, which is a point I've talked about many times before, is almost like an aside, but it's a really rich, deep question for people interested in political economy, which is, although the FX exposure has been evened out, of course, the balance sheets where the reserves sit and where the debt exposures sit are very different. One is government and one is private. And so when the stuff hits the fan, who is going to be handing out which reserves to which counterparty to provide the insurance that we think these war chests provide? That is, to put it mildly, a very delicate political economy problem. So, conclusions in my no seconds remaining. I have some two-handed conclusions in the style of an economist. There are obviously some reasons for optimism here. Overall, the gross positions have stabilized. There are big reserve buffers, and the FX mismatch has faded away a little bit. And there was a kind of crash test dummy moment there in 2008 where the emerging markets were exposed to one of the biggest crises in economic history, and mostly sailed through. But there are also some reasons for caution or pessimism. There's a lot of heterogeneity. There are many countries with negative NFA and current account positions, so they might still be perceived as fragile. And the FX mismatch is still there, at least within economies, in the difference between official assets and private sector liabilities. And especially in recent years, some of these things may have gotten worse. So my takeaway from this is, maybe in contrast to Phil, this could drive more reserve accumulation going forward if enough emerging economies perceive those risks as still material. And then lastly, some one-handed conclusions. Can we reach this symmetry that Phil seems to think we might get to or might want to get to in combination with macro-financial stability? I think in the long run that depends on emerging countries becoming advanced, really advanced, not advanced in scare quotes. But that could take a long time, and until then the asymmetries will probably persist, with growing emerging economies, growing in scale and macro weight globally, and growing in terms of the universe of countries that are in EM positions, opening up to financial flows and becoming medium and medium-high income economies. That may be a more powerful effect, pushing us in the direction of more and more countries wanting to accumulate, like Korea and the other EMs, ever larger war chests. And that could be a bit of a tricky problem because of the work of Triffin, of course. We don't necessarily have a sufficient safe asset supply to meet that demand in the very long run. And I will conclude there and leave you to figure out what might happen next. Thank you.
Thank you. We will proceed directly to the second paper by Helene Ray on whether there is a global financial cycle and what to do about it.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the organizers to include me in the program. It's a very nice conference, first time in Korea. I'm going to discuss some work which is in fact more or less coming from two papers. One is the paper that you have in the folder, which is the paper I wrote for Jackson Hole. And the second paper I will draw some of my material from is joint work with Silvia Miranda Agrippino, and the title is World Asset Markets and the Global Financial Cycle. So apologies to my discussant because that's quite a lot of material. Now, broadly, the main question I'm seeking to address in those works are what are the consequences of financial globalization on the workings of national financial system and on the transmission of monetary policy. So in particular, via the large flows of credit and investments crossing borders of the type that we have seen in the previous papers. So in other words, what is the impact of large international flows and financial globalization on the international transmission of monetary policy? So that's a large topic, and here I will mainly talk about some empirical evidence, which I hope is useful to inform some more theoretical modeling. So in the Jackson Hole paper, I showed some evidence on the global financial cycle defined in terms of common movements in gross capital flows and credit growth around the world. And I also showed that not only there is a lot of commonality in those gross capital inflows in various asset classes and in various parts of the world, but also these inflows were negatively correlated with indices of market volatility and market risk aversion, such as the VIX. Now, in this presentation, I will document the global financial cycle in terms of risky asset prices in main financial markets around the world. And I will also show that there is a lot of commonality there if we look at movement in risky asset prices defined as stocks, corporate bonds, commodities. I am effectively also, in this paper, building a very simple illustrative framework with global banks, who are going to be important for the transmission of monetary policy, and also other investors, such as asset managers. So unfortunately, that framework I won't have time to present today. I will concentrate instead on the empirical evidence on the role of US monetary policy within the global financial cycle. So to what extent is US monetary policy driving credit flows, capital flows, on top of the usual variables such as investment consumption. So in other words, what I'm hoping to contribute to with all this empirical evidence is to document something that maybe looks a bit more like the international credit channel of monetary policy, a channel that has been not formalized or not much studied so far. So the first piece of the evidence is on this global financial cycle in risky assets. So here I'm just presenting you the largely how we estimate a common factor, a global common factor in risky asset prices, and I will show you what it looks like. So what we are doing is we are taking as large a cross-section as possible of risky asset prices. So as I said, that means stocks, that means corporate bonds, and that means some commodity prices as well. And we are going to estimate a model which you find here at the bottom of the slides, where to this very large vector risky asset prices, we are going to see how much of the variance of the data is driven by one global factor, and then some various sub-factors, which can be regional factors or market-specific factors, and then finally an idiosyncratic component. The composition of the asset price panels we use two different ones. We use one longer one, which goes back to 1975, which is unfortunately less broad than a shorter one, which will cover more continents, but which starts in 1990. And we try to include all the prices of risky assets that are available for our exercise. What we find, and I won't have time to comment on any of these statistics, but by doing the standards test, we find that one global factor explains a large fraction of these of the variance in the data. So in the case of the first sample, we find as much as 66% of the variance is explained by one global factor. In the second sample, which is the more heterogeneous sample, we find 21%, which is still a lot given the heterogeneity in the data. So this is formally the model we estimate. We fit a number of factors to these risky asset prices, or we estimate it in return, so that the data is stationary. We allow for a different VAR process for the factors. They can be correlated with one another. And we also model the idiosyncratic component part of the data. So now I don't have time to go in details, but I think it's suffice to see more or less this matrix here. So we have our risky returns, which have the vector YT, and we impose that they all load on one global factor, which is FTG here. So you see that there are all these lambda 1, lambda, etc., which are all the loading on the global factors. And the other factors load only for, so for example, you have an American factor, you may have an European factor, an Asian factor, etc. Now, here is the result of the estimation. You find the two samples here, but I will focus mostly on the one starting in 1990 because it's the broadest panel that we have. And we see that the global factor extracted from this heterogeneous set of risky asset prices. So this is the dark line. So it's estimated on monthly data. And of course, we see quite a bit of variation in this global factor. In particular, so the shaded areas are the NBER recessions. And we have the 2008 crisis, which is quite apparent. Now, in the very simple asset pricing model that we write down in the paper, so this global factor can be decomposed into a volatility component and an aggregate risk aversion component, so market risk aversion component. not surprisingly, maybe, then if we look at the data on existing indices which are traded on markets and which actually reflect implicit volatility, therefore which reflect the volatility and aggregate risk aversion of the markets, such as the VIX, we see that this global factor, which is again the dark line here, this global factor is very highly correlated with the VIX. Again, it's not so surprising if we think of this interpretation of a factor as reflecting some aggregate risk and aggregate market risk aversion. So the VIX is the dotted line, and the global factor is the dark line. Correlation is pretty high, on the order of minus 0.7 for the VIX. And the VIX is North American specific, but we have the equivalent in Europe, that's the VSTOXX, in the UK, that's the VFTSE, and in Japan, VNKY. And you see that all these indices reflecting, again, aggregate risk and market-wide risk aversion are very highly correlated with one another, and are also very highly correlated with the global factor that we estimate. There's also some other interesting correlation with other measures of risk. We have put here the Gilchrist and Zachar-Guest measure of risk premia, which is built from corporate bond data. The correlation is a little bit less high than in the case of the VIX-style indices. Now, what we can do is to decompose our global factor into two components, one which is linked to the pure volatility, and that's going to be the global realized variance, which is constructed from daily data on stock market data, and it's just a global realized variance. And the second one is just going to be the residual of our global factor after it is projected on the global realized variance. That is to say, the second panel, the battle panel, can be interpreted as the aggregate market risk aversion, according to our very simple model again. So you see that what is interesting there is, so indeed, if we look at the global realized variance, we had a very flat period between 2003 and 2006, 2007. If we look at the aggregate risk aversion that we recover from our global factor, you see that during that period, we have a slide in risk aversion. So a decrease in risk aversion, and then again a spike during the crisis, not exactly at the same time as the volatility spike, but slightly different, but it's definitely a spike during the global crisis. So that's a very simple decomposition of our global component here. But the second, I guess, and the big part of the paper is about what is the role of monetary policy in all that. And so in the very simple model that we present, we have global banks which operate on integrated financial markets, everything in dollar. The reason we do that is because the dollar is big international currency. It's the main currency in international banking. So dollar liquidity is a very important parameter in global banking and for leveraging of financial intermediaries, in particular during that period, 2003 to 2007, on which we have seen this slide in risk aversion there. So how are we going to look at the effect of U.S. monetary policy on these variables, which are risky asset prices, which are these volatility indices, these capital flows, credit creation, leverage, etc. So all these variables are very relevant for the so-called credit channel transmission of monetary policy, or risk-taking channel of transmission of monetary policy. But of course, the problem is that in usual monetary policy VARs, we do small-scale VARs because of the curse of dimensionality. So somehow we have to find a way of putting in our monetary policy VARs not only the usual variables relevant for monetary policy, which we look at, inflation, industrial production, investment, housing starts, etc., but also these financial markets-related variables, these financial flow variables. So the way we are going to to do that here is by estimating a Bayesian VAR, which allows us to use, we'll have several versions of it between 22 and 26 variables. And we'll also have 2 types of identification strategy for our Bayesian VAR. So in this Bayesian VAR I'm going to show you, I will have both the typical set of macroeconomic variables that we look at, coming from output data, labor data, etc., but also variables on global credit, on cross-border flows, and on leverage of different financial intermediaries. I'm not only going to look at US financial intermediary leverage, but also I'm going to look at European global banks leverage, because they were so important in international markets, and they were effectively channeling liquidity also to Europe and to Asia and back to the US. And I will also have my global factor and risk premia. So my 2 identification strategies will be, one will be a usual Cholesky style identification, where there will be block ordering between slow-moving variable and fast-moving variables. And another one, I will use an instrumental VAR, when I will identify the monetary policy shock with some external instrument. So this is the list of at least one version of a Bayesian, of a variable of one version of a Bayesian VAR I'm gonna run. So I'm not expecting you to remember all these acronyms, but I will show you some snapshots of the results, and I will remind you what the variables are. But you can see that, so kind of the top of the table, we have a lot of variables, the usual variables linked to the real economy. We have personal consumption expenditures, we have investment, we have housing starts, we have then the price deflators, various price deflators. And then the bottom part, you see that we have, that's where we have the financial sector style variable with the domestic credit, global domestic credit, and then the cross-border flows, and also the various measures of leverage, etc. My global factor as well. All right. So how do we, why is our Bayesian VAR? We build, I have to say, to write down this Bayesian VAR, we build on a lot of new work, existing work by a number of authors who have done all the hard econometric work for us. And we are estimating this Bayesian VAR with quite a bit of robustness checks using various lags, going from 22 to 26 variables. We estimate on the whole sample, and then up to 2007, up to 2009. So we are doing a number of different different exercises there. So the monetary policy instrument is the effective federal fund rate. And all the results I'm going to show you now, because I'm sure you are now very impatient to see those results after all this long introduction. So they are you will see impulse response functions. The monetary policy shock is 100 basis points increase in the effective federal fund rate. And so everything is expressed in percentage points so that you can read easily the results. Here we go. So here's one set of results. So here I have 22 of those variables, and I will do a snapshot of some of those. So again, don't worry. But so the thing to, I guess, to get out of this first panel is that if we look at, so the first variables, the real economy variable, US GDP, industrial production, this is the personal consumption expenditure, this is going to be investment, so this is personal income, this is investment, this is employment, this is housing start, consumer sentiment. All these more or less react in a way that would be kind of textbook. So to teach about the effect of monetary policy, you could use that. This is what they do, what monetary policy is supposed to do to this variable, including the price variable. So if you look at your GDP deflator and your personal consumption expenditure deflator that you find on the third row here, you will see that they behave very nicely. Now, the new stuff is, of course, what is below, so the third row, starting with cross-border flows, GCB, cross-border flows to bank, cross-border flow to non-bank, USB LEV, which is the banking leverage in the US, EU banking leverage. And my global factor, which is at the bottom here, the last row, the first one is my global factor. So what we see here is that the tightening of monetary policy has a sizable effect on global domestic credit, a sizable effect negative on cross-border flows, a negative effect on US banking leverage, on European bank leverage as well, and on my global factor as well. So a negative effect on the price of risky asset, this global component of price, as well as leads to an increase in volatility, which is the GR-VAR variable there. Now, if you look at it in more detail, you see that the effect of a monetary tightening on global domestic credit, on cross-border credit to banks or to non-banks for that matter, is sizable in terms of economic size, because we're talking here about big numbers. So we see a big negative effect on this, measures of credit. If we look at the banking sector leverage, so we see a short-lived increase in the US banking sector leverage and then a decrease. And there is a kind of similar pattern, but less well estimated in the EU banking sector leverage. So these measures of leverage are aggregate measures of leverage, which are based on, it's really, you have to think of them as measures of loans divided by deposits. So these are nationwide style of leverage. But we also use different measures of leverage, such as broker-dealer leverage. And there, the kind of shape would be the same, except that the deleveraging of the broker-dealer would be a lot quicker. So you'd see in the US, you would see the deleveraging coming a lot quicker, a lot sharper, and then rebounding. And actually, if you look at the global systematically important banks, you would see the same pattern as the broker-dealers. And so if you look at the European big banks and you construct leverage from microdata, you see that indeed the deleveraging is, the decrease in leverage is quicker. So it's kind of, it goes first to the broker-dealers and then it spreads to more aggregate measures of leverage in the economy. So that's what you find. Here is what you find in increase in volatility. Here's what happens to the global asset price factor, so a decrease in the global asset price factor. And this is the Gilchrist-Zarakis measure of excess bond premium, which goes up. All right, so this is, don't have time to show you all these details. I just want to mention that all these results are qualitatively and to a large extent quantitatively the same if we take a second type of identification, which is using an external instrument, building again on recent work of other people here. So in terms of instrument, we use the Romer and Romer narrative approach, and we extend their narrative instrument to the recent period. We can therefore, because it's correlated with a monetary policy shock, we can recover the impulse response for monetary policy. And when we do that, so here I superimpose all our results with this second set of identification with the results I show you. And what one can see is that everything is kind of consistent with one another. So I won't get into any detail, but we will do everything with this other set of identification. Here this is a version with 26 variables, and you see that everything pretty much goes through. So, to conclude, so empirically what we find is that there is a global financial cycle. In here what I showed you is that there is a global factor that explains an important part of the variance of a large cross-section of returns of risky assets around the world. We have used a large Bayesian VER in order to allow us to estimate the effect of monetary policy not only on the traditional variables but also on the financial variables and the global variables, so global credit creation and financial flows, and also this global factor in asset prices. And we find that US monetary policy is one of the drivers of this global financial cycle.
Jonathan Austrie is the second discussant.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you to the organizers, the Bank of Korea, for inviting me. I want to say that I've been to a few of these presenting or discussing, and the topics are generally spot on. This year is no exception, and so congratulations to Barry and Tom for always putting together such a wonderful program. Needless to say, the views I'm about to express are my own and not the IMF's. So let me start by thanking Hélène for her presentation, and more importantly, for putting on the table a very important issue, which is how financial globalization affects the transmission of U.S. monetary policy to other countries. I'm going to talk mainly about the paper that Hélène submitted to the conference, the one that's in your folder. She talked about both, as she said. And I'm going to be a little bit more policy-oriented because the paper that she submitted is the policy paper. It's the Jackson Hole paper. And so let me just start by summarizing some of the key results, which are that really there is a global financial cycle. There is an important global component to a bunch of heterogeneous risky asset prices around the world. That global component is highly correlated with the VIX. This is very much in line, as Hélène explained, with what you might think would occur under a global CAPM type of framework. One of the questions I would have is sort of how big is this global component vis-a-vis one's expectations of what would result from such a global CAPM framework? Is this 25%? She has two samples, as she mentioned, but for one of them it's around a quarter. Is that number large or small? It would be nice to hear her views on that. One of the points that she stresses in the Jackson Hole paper, which is that it's really gross flows rather than net flows that are correlated with the VIX. And I have no problem with the role of gross flows, but some of my priors are really that net flows would also be importantly correlated with the VIX. And I think that prior comes from some of the work that's been done on the emerging markets. And I think if you split her sample, that result would come through. Now, she talked about the role of U.S. monetary policy as being an instigator of this global financial crisis. And this is very much sort of putting in an international context the sort of closed economy credit channel of monetary policy that's been documented over recent decades and years. And it builds on an earlier tradition of Calvo et al. And the international transmission of U.S. monetary policy. So this comes with a sort of a pedigree that I think is well understood. Again, one of the things that she didn't talk about, but I am going to make heavy weather of, it is a central theme of the Jackson Hole paper, is not only that countries have to contend with this global financial cycle irrespective of their exchange rate regime. There is a further step in the argument, which is that the exchange rate regime really doesn't seem to matter with how this cycle is transmitted to other countries. And one of the questions I'm going to have as we go forward is whether there's a bit of a logical leap here in that I didn't see any explicit conditioning of the results in the paper on the exchange rate regime. The last part of her Jackson Hole paper is about the possible policy solutions, and she mentions four. Micro and macro prudential regulation, that's two, capital controls, and policy coordination. I wondered whether there isn't, in fact, a fifth possible solution, which is the use of sterilized foreign exchange intervention as an additional policy instrument. That's something I'm going to come back to in a moment. I think the sort of pecking order that I get as being Hélène's pecking order is that macroprudential regulation and microprudential are probably the most likely to succeed in providing some insulation from the global financial cycle. I don't think she's a wild enthusiast of capital controls. I may be wrong. And I don't think she believes that policy coordination stands a reasonable chance of succeeding. Is this still going? Yep. Okay. So one of the first substantive points I want to make is whether EMEs are different. As she pointed out, her sample is a very heterogeneous sample. It covers both advanced and emerging market countries. And I think along some dimensions, emerging market countries are different. And one such dimension is the correlation of the VIX with net flows. As I mentioned, she speaks about the correlation with gross flows, and I have no issue with that. But I think there is a kind of long history of findings that suggest that the VIX is correlated with net flows to EMEs. And when you combine EMEs and advanced countries in the same sample, because of safe haven and other effects, you're going to mix and match here, and you're not going to see that correlation with net flows. So it's sort of a factual thing, but I think there's an important policy implication, is that you want to monitor net flows not only for the reasons that Hélène talks about in her paper, that is in terms of sustainability and in terms of the macroeconomic effects, but also for the financial stability effects that she is concerned with in her work. The other point I want to make is that different components of the financial account have different sensitivities to the global financial cycle. This is something that she does talk about, but I think more could be made of it. And I think it's important to do that because the financial accounts are changing over time in a way that I think makes them more sensitive to the global financial cycle. The other thing that I think could receive a little bit more attention is sort of what is behind what the Fed is doing. So we talk about the links from U.S. monetary policy to the VIX, to the credit flows extended by the large financial institutions. But I think the nature of the spillovers, the nature of how emerging market countries experience those spillovers really depends on why the Fed is acting. And this is, a central theme in a lot of the spillover work that the fund has done, and also its bilateral surveillance work. So if the Fed is acting because of good news about growth versus sort of cost push news about inflation, the nature of the spillover is going to be quite different. Yep. So let me talk about something that Hélène did not talk about, but it is the title of her paper is Dilemma, Not Trilemma. And so really it is about the irrelevancy of the exchange rate regime at some level. And really what I want to say is, if we were in Scotland and this was a jury trial, I think the verdict would be not proven. That basically, in order to make statements about the role of the exchange rate regime, about the morphing of the trilemma into a dilemma, you want to condition your results on the exchange rate regime. You want to split the sample. You want to allow for interaction terms. And I think this is something that subsequent versions of this work could usefully do to really strengthen the case that the regime is irrelevant. It's clear to me that in the numbers that she presents, countries do experience idiosyncratic shocks, and yes, U.S. monetary policy and the VIX and so forth are important, but the role of movements in the federal funds rate on the VIX, the importance of the global factor in the variance of global risky asset returns, they're not the whole story. They're one factor amongst many. Some of the work that I have done that was presented at the same conference where Hélène presented her Mundell Fleming lecture suggests that really the exchange rate regime is not a sideshow, and that it is not a sideshow along the dimension that Hélène thinks is very important, namely the credit channel, that basically inflexible exchange rate regimes behave very differently in terms of their propensity to experience credit booms and busts, foreign exchange rate denominated lending booms and busts. They differ quite substantially across exchange rate regimes. I have the third panel there on exchange rate valuation, overvaluation, which is also another dimension on which the exchange rate regime matters. These financial vulnerabilities, which differ according to the exchange rate regime, also translate into the susceptibility to experience crisis, which also differs across exchange rate regimes. This is not just a feature of the historical data, but our JIE paper of a couple years ago also documents that it was a factor during the recent global financial crisis. I think, there is a lot, this is obviously an ongoing issue, but a paper that I discussed last year by Maury Opsfeld also suggests that, the exchange rate regime is hardly irrelevant in terms of the extent of monetary policy autonomy that countries have, and this echoes earlier findings by Klein and Shamball. Last part really has to do with the policy side. Again, I think the paper could usefully also discuss, in addition to the four policy options that were discussed in the paper, the role of foreign exchange market intervention. This is an additional tool that can help countries to insulate themselves from the global financial cycle. So I think this is something that can be further discussed. I think, here I'm letting my own biases come through a bit, but really I think we need to stop being so apologetic about capital controls. Ray the way I read the paper is that yes, the benefits from financial integration are really hard to identify in the paper, but capital controls, while they might be a solution, we perhaps need to think twice before using them. I think really some of the concerns about capital controls apply equally well to macroprudential regulation, and so I think a year or two ago at this conference, I discussed some of the work that we've done on this, suggesting really that there is no moral superiority of one tool over another. It really depends on the nature of the underlying distortion, which instrument will be corrective rather than distortive. So again, we should get out of the sort of knee-jerk habit of endorsing one type of instrument in favor of the other. Multilateral cooperation, I think Ray sort of makes the point that the concern is that this may interfere with domestic mandates. I think, again, more clarity on this is needed. Whenever I'm observing sort of a group of different countries talking about each other's policies, I always observe that country A has plenty of suggestions for country B about how it ought to change its policies to benefit the world and itself, and vice versa for country B vis-a-vis country A. To me, that is prima facie evidence of gains from policy coordination, and indeed, some of the work suggests that gains from multilateral macro policy coordination might be of the same order of magnitude from multilateral trade liberalization, on which the international community devotes quite a bit of efforts. And of course, when Pareto improvements are not going to be achievable, then we need to think about rules of the road. We have them to some extent for current account transactions, but I think one of the things that Hélène's work highlights is the need to think harder about rules of the road related to the financial account. So my key takeaways are really a wonderful contribution on this critical issue of how the global financial cycle impacts different countries and the role of the transmission of monetary policy. but more is needed to establish the irrelevancy of the exchange rate regime in how countries experience that cycle. Thank you.
So, Helene, you have a trilemma. Do you want to respond now or later?
Let me start. Wonderful discussion. Thank you very, very much. So, exchange rate regime, right. So, I didn't want to burden you with yet another 2 papers. But so, as far as these, so 2 things: the co-movements, of credit growth and flows and asset prices with the VIX are concerned. So you can indeed condition on the various exchange rate regime. So an exercise that I undertake in one paper, which is just coming out in the Economic Journal, and a tiny bit of that in the Jackson Hole paper, but not very developed, as you pointed out. Yes, so but to the extent, all the usual uncertainties about do we measure well exchange rate regimes and they change over time, etc., the interaction term doesn't seem to be there. But another, I think, more maybe interesting way of looking at it, which is something I started to do in the Mundell-Fleming lecture, is to say, okay, which are the countries which supposedly are the better insulated from the global financial cycle? So these are the small open economy, inflation targeters with good, well-developed financial asset markets. So, for example, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Sweden. Okay, and so what I did there is that I re-estimated some monetary policy VAR. This one, the identification comes with the external instruments, so Karady-Gertler type of identification scheme. And I look at the effect of the U.S. monetary policy shock on the measures I could find at the time for the external finance premium, so the credit channel of monetary policy. That is to say, so what I can find is usually the mortgage, some kind of mortgage spread. And what I find is there is some heterogeneity across this small set, admittedly, of inflation targeters, but in all of them, I find a significant effect of U.S. monetary policy on this external finance premium. And the magnitude of that effect, of course, more or less precisely estimated, but is in the ballpark of what you would find on U.S. data on the external finance premium. Hence, we may think, maybe the credit channel is not an important channel of monetary policy, and if we think that for the U.S., then we think that for the other guys as well. Or we think it is an important channel. I think it is. And then, at least at this point in time, it's hard to rule out that it's not of the same order of magnitude for these inflation targeters, which are my purest example of countries which should be insulated from the global financial cycle. Grant you, more work is needed, but I think it's an important area to investigate further.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left, and the floor is open. I see microphones in the aisles. Yes, Marco in front.
So a question I have is, suppose we better insulate some countries from the global financial cycle. Is it possible that would lead them to have a more pronounced domestic cycle, so that actually the domestic policy shocks would play a bigger role than they do now? So you replace one source of volatility with another one.
Thank you. Why don't we collect a few if we can? While people collect their thoughts, let me pose mine for both of the authors. Evidently, there is such a thing as a global financial cycle, and evidently the Fed plays a special role in it because currency mismatches are important in the data, and the dollar figures prominently in those currency mismatches as the funding currency for a lot of international financial transactions. Does this mean that the Fed should worry more about the impact of its policy decisions on other countries in the international system?
So I think there's two elements to that. I mean,
We're collecting, Philip.
sorry. Okay.
We have Dr. Che in front.
Thank you for exciting presentations and comments. I have 2 points to comment. First, I have a question for Professor Lane's presentations. After, I think, Asian crisis and emerging market economies, they try to manage their balance sheet problems, right? So they effectively turned their positions from a net debtor to net creditor. And in recent years, as Hyun Sung Shin and others pointed out, the corporate sector, they increased the leverage in terms of dollars. And they played the role of pseudo financial intermediaries. So they funneled the liquidity raised from abroad into domestic markets. Now, with the global liquidity unwinding, which might be kicked off U.S. interest rate hikes, and then what would happen to this problem? I think that there could be a liquidity dry up in corporate bond market, and then there might be quite downward spiral in terms of market liquidity or endogenous liquidity. So this kind of impact is not well perceived. Maybe Professor Bruno Meyer will emphasize on the intermediation theory of money later. So in this regard, what would be your view if such kind of channel becomes important? And the second question is about Professor Lei's presentation. She has very comprehensive model framework to examine the impact of a U.S. interest rate hike using global and the regional and the domestic framework. I'm wondering about the impact of U.S. interest rate hike on U.S. domestic credit. My perception is that if there is a U.S. interest rate hike, then emerging market economy will suffer from capital outflows. On the other hand, the U.S. will have capital reflows into the domestic economy, and they have a higher interest rate. And then perhaps U.S. Financial intermediaries, they will have a stronger incentive to lend out. So financial re-intermediation could be triggered. So I'm wondering whether there should be a decrease in domestic credit in the U.S., or the converse is the case. Thank you.
We have a question.
If the Professor Ray's the global finance cycle works in the both in advanced economies and the global emerging market economies, and if the Fed begins to exit or begins to return to the real normalization of policy rate or federal fund rate, then should the central banks, the inflation targeters in emerging market economies should revise their reaction function in order to respond to this shock from the federal fund rate in the coming October or in December this year or next year? Thank you.
And I see a hand in back.
Thank you. I'm His Kim from the Bank of Korea. My question is directed to Professor Allen. Is it unavoidable, the global financial cycle for emerging market economies, when they open their capital accounts fully and still their domestic financial market is not mature enough? And so fear of floating or even not allowing full convertibility of the currency in the offshore market. So it seems that Dr. Ostry gives some answers to it. exchange rate regime matters. So the dilemma for emerging market economy is two-pronged. First, they have to develop their own financial market, and at the same time, they have to deepen their foreign exchange market. But the current shallowness of the domestic financial market and the shallowness of the foreign exchange market make it necessary for the government to make interventions, even if it takes an inflation target regime for monetary policy and the exchange free floating exchange rate under floating exchange rate regime, if not a fully floating exchange rate regime. So there is contradiction. If you intervene in certain market, you are repressing the private sectors, repressing the market forces, and distorting the markets. So if you intervene more, you create some kind of moral hazard. So intervention and increasing the foreign reserve itself brings about more foreign currency denominated bond issues and liabilities, so making the financial system more vulnerable to external shocks. So how to overcome the two-pronged issue? But it seems that we have only one means to address the problem, while we have two problems at hand. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think that is plenty for our authors to chew on, starting with Professor Lane for 2 minutes or so.
Okay, thanks, Barry. So clearly, across the two papers, there's a good amount of similar topics. So I'll leave a chunk of the comments to Helene. But the issue that was raised, I do think is substantive, and it's one particular dimension which I talked about here was the emerging market corporate bonds. But this is part of a wider issue in the sense of the rise of non-bank credit in Europe has been pretty big since the crisis as well. Again, because of it's a little bit like the last speaker there, with the restrictions on the banking sector, both in terms of their own incentives to delever and also tougher regulation in terms of credit. There is this big unknown. Is if you have a bigger reliance on bond funding, what happens if for whatever reason, the bond market freezes? That either because there's worse fundamentals in emerging markets, and so, or with interest rate normalization, there's more attractive dollar investments and perceived safer investments, maybe in the US. And then the issue is whether that kind of a self-feeding issue where the market liquidity in turn causes further problems. So, I think this is a big issue. And for emerging markets, it goes back to, when and if do you deploy the stockpile of foreign exchange reserves that, Alan Taylor was mentioning earlier on. But we're already seeing this on a week-by-week basis. I think we've seen reports out of China about, various moves to try and improve FX liquidity for some types of debtors. Russia is a very big case study over the last year and a half, because with the big decline in commodity prices, the adverse economic shocks hitting Russia, but for economic and geopolitical reasons, what looked like really good fundamentals for some Russian corporates in the energy sector and so on now look very different. So, this issue about, Alan's work with Jay and Maury, I think a lot of that was basically saying, listen, you can run from the domestic financial system. You need to hold reserves because there might be a domestic run where people want to run out of the local currency into dollars. This is a slightly different issue now, which is basically there are more and more dollar liabilities. And if the refinancing of those dollar liabilities freezes, then you have countries which do have large stockpiles of foreign currency. And the question is, and it's related to Jonathan Ostrey's point there about FX intervention, sterilised FX intervention. Thinking about the role of central banks and central bank balance sheet policies, which has dominated the discussion in advanced economies in recent years, there's very related discussions to be had for emerging markets. Let me just, use a few seconds to respond to Barry. So there's I think multiple levels about this issue about global policy coordination role of the US. Of course, the US, it could run its monetary policy for global welfare criteria, and it would look more overseas on that. But even on its, in relation to its current mandate, it's a kind of a long-term issue, which is the more and more countries are affected by US monetary conditions, the spill back to the US is going to be deeper. And we're seeing it already with the dollar appreciation causing, I think, a pause in the timing of the increase in the US interest rate decision. And, I think the US Federal Reserve System, and we have people here today employed by that system, understanding more and more the full global consequences of US monetary policy decisions, and the spill back to the US from that is obviously a big agenda item in its own self-interest for the Federal Reserve.
Thank you. Helene?
Yeah, lots of very interesting questions. So let me start, Marco. So is it, if you insulate from global volatility, do you get more volatility domestically? I would argue, there's nothing, not necessarily at all, because one way of thinking about insulation, this insulation business, I think there are several tools that can be used, which were described also by Jonathan. So either we think, so let alone the Fed internalizing this. So let's say the Fed does not internalize whatever happens, okay. Then, so you have country-level tools, which are macroprudential tools or capital flow management tools, capital controls, pretty bluntly. Or one can think also of decreasing this effect of a cycle if we think it goes indeed through a credit channel, okay, to some of the evidence points towards that. Then how important this transmission channel is will depend on the ability of a system to leverage. And so one thing you can do is if you go for the transmission channel and if you limit ability to leverage globally, which is in some sense what Basel III has started to do, then you should decrease volatility both at the global level, but also it doesn't mean that you are going to repatriate more volatility at the domestic level. So you have to take a stand on the transmission channel, and if you believe this is the right transmission channel, then you can do things which are going to limit what I guess people at the BIS have called the excess sensitivity of credit creation in some sense. So that's one way of thinking about it. It's probably not the only way. I think, so there's one important thing to understand about, and it's linked to fear of floating and all that. So in a lot of the VRs one estimates, one does see that there is an endogenous response of monetary policy of other countries to a Fed hike. So it's not one for one, but there is some endogenous response. So to some extent, that means that can be interpreted as fear of floating or some kind of management of the concern about where the exchange rate goes. Okay, so that's one way through which, of course, there is an international monetary policy spillovers. And the fact, but it's not the only way. So in some sense, the old Mendelian trilemma was true in a world in which there was one instrument that was very important, that was the interest rate. And if you had the instrument, and you played with that instrument, more or less you could do a lot of things. And if you had a flexible exchange rate, 1 degree of freedom was enough to kind of gain autonomy. Now, this is not true at all in a world in which there are various transmission channels of monetary policy, okay, which can go through, one of which being something like the credit channel or the risk-taking channel. And so in that sense, this is why also running regressions where we see that in flexible exchange rate regime, short-term policy rates are not as correlated under flexible exchange rate and under fixed rate. Of course, that's true. You can move your short-term policy rate more if you have a flexible exchange rate. But that's not the end of the story, and this is what the paper in particular by Mori, Opsfeld, Fine, etc. But that's not the end of the story, because this is not the only channel of monetary policy transmission. And one very important, for example, stylized facts also that comes out of the paper of Mori Opsfeld is this increased correlation of long rate, which are completely decorrelated from the movements in the short rate and co-move a lot more. So we have to think about models where there are, so I think, diverse transmission channels and identify which ones are the most important ones. Other than that, should central bank in emerging market revise their reaction functions because of a global financial cycle? Well, so somebody mentioned there's only this instrument, the interest rate, and we are trying to do a lot of things with the interest rate, but it's not true. So from what I just mentioned, we also have the macroprudential tools, the capital flow management tools, and we have international regulatory tools which apply to everyone, but that can help. So this is by playing, I think, on all these margins that we can actually do something.
All right. Thank you to one and all. I think we have time now for an abbreviated coffee break.